Hello everyone, in this video we will discuss about how exactly the sexual reproduction takes place in the plant. In last session we discussed about what is a male gamete of the plant and what is a female gamete of the plant. That is the pollen grain and the egg. Now in sexual reproduction the most important thing is fusion, mixing of the male and the female gamete. But as you have seen in the structure, the male gamete is somewhere else, whereas the female gamete is somewhere else. How to mate them or how they are meeting is what we are going to discuss in this session. So it is said that sexual reproduction takes place in two steps. The first is pollination and second is fertilization. Please remember the two steps in which the reproduction takes place in plants: pollination and fertilization. Pollination related to pollen grains. Now this whole reproduction can be related to a story. Suppose the girl is locked in the room and the boy wants to meet the girl. Okay, or how will it meet? Okay, so here the boy is a pollen grain, whereas the girl is an egg which is locked in the ovary. The room of the girl in the plant is ovary. Now what happens? First the boy has to come to the girl's house. He has to ring the bell, and then only the boy can reach the room and meet the girl. In the same way, the pollen grain first goes and sits on the stigma. Okay, if you have seen, the pollen grain will first, suppose I just draw a rough diagram of flower, which is saying this is your anther, this is your filament, and here you have a stigma, style, and ovary. So somewhere here, if you see, is the egg cell, and here is a pollen grain. So what happens in pollination is the pollen grain from the anther gets transferred to the stigma. Okay, the boy is going and ringing the doorbell of the girl's house. So here the pollen grain from the anther has to transfer to the stigma of the flower. So this transfer of pollen grains from the anther to the stigma of the flower is said to be pollination. It has to be carried to the door, and this door is stigma, and it is said to be pollination. Now this pollination is of two types. It is said to be self-pollination and cross-pollination. If the pollen grain is transferred on the stigma of the same flower, okay, then it is said to be self-pollination. But if the pollen grain is transferred to the stigma of the different flower, this is one flower, there is this, both structures are present in one flower, petal, sepal. Imagine the structure. Okay, so if it is in the same flower, it is said to be self-pollination. If the pollen grain, there are chances that the pollen grain can go to another flower also. So if the pollen grain gets transferred to another flower, it is said to be cross-pollination. The flower can be in the same plant or in another plant as well. Okay, the flower can be in the same plant or another plant as well, but it should be of same species. Like a pollen grain from a mango plant will go to a mango plant only, then only the fertilization will take place. Okay, so pollination, what is pollination? Transfer of pollen grains from anther to stigma. There are two types of pollination, self and cross. And finally, the boy can either go on a bike, in a bus, in an auto rickshaw. In the same way, the pollen grain from the anther has to be transferred to the stigma. The pollinators, like we use vehicles, here there are pollinators. The agents which carry the pollen grains, what are the agents? Either insects can carry them, either animals can carry them, or they can be carried away by wind or water. Okay, so these are the four major types of pollinators. Pollinators, basically the things which carry the pollen grain from the anther to stigma, are said to be pollinators. There are four types of pollinators: insects, animals, wind and water. Right? So this is the first step, that is going to the female part. Who is going to the female part? The male is going to the female part. Now let's see what happens in the second step. That is fertilization. Fertilization. Basically, fertilization means now the male and the female are close to each other, mixed with each other. Okay, there is a fusion of male and female gamete. So this fertilization in plants again occurs in two steps: formation of pollen tube and fusion of male and female gamete. Now let me first complete the analogy part. Analogy is the boy goes and rings the bell of the girl. That is, it comes to the stigma. After that, the door opens and you see father. Father will not allow the boy to go to the girl's room. So what is the boy doing? Climbing on the pipe outside the house and going to the window and finally reaching the girl's room. As you see in the movie Kuch Kuch Hota Hai, if you have seen, the Shah Rukh Khan goes through climbs through the stairs, or it has some say ladder type of, and it climbs on that and meets Rani Mukherjee. Same way, there is a tube being formed inside the female reproductive part of the flower. Okay, now I come back to the flower. I was just giving you an example. Now come back to the flower. Don't be in the film. Okay, so what happens in the flower? Once the pollen grain reaches the stigma, okay, once the pollen grain reaches the stigma, it has to form a pipe. Then only it can go and meet the egg cell, which is the female part of the plant. So what happens? The pollen tube is being formed. This pipe which is formed, it is formed because of when the pollen grain reaches the stigma, then this blue color tube is being formed, and it is said to be the pollen tube, which is connecting the stigma to the ovary. And in this pollen tube, this white color structures, which are said to be the male gametes or polar nuclei, they are also said to be polar nuclei. The male gametes or the polar nuclei gets transferred in this pollen tube and comes slowly comes down and meets the egg cell. Okay, so this polar nuclei slowly will come down like this. They will travel through the pipe and finally sees the egg cell and becomes happy. Yes, finally I have met the female part. And then the formation of pollen tube, transfer of polar nuclei and the pollen tube, and finally the polar nuclei and the egg fuses together and it leads to the formation of zygote. Okay, so the fusion of male and female gamete, that is a polar nuclei and the egg, leads to the formation of zygote, and then zygote will be converted into embryo. And let's see what happens after that. Okay, once the tube is formed, once the boy has reached the girl's place, they say shake hands, and finally there is a meeting of the boy and the girl. Similarly, here finally in the flower itself, okay, in the flower itself, the male gamete is coming and meeting the female gamete. Now let's see what happens after fertilization has taken place. What will happen to the flower? Because I have never seen a flower. Okay, so finally it is said that post fertilization changes, means once the male and the female has met, what will happen? The zygote which is formed will be converted into embryo after several mitotic divisions. Division means one cell is dividing into 2, 2 into 4, 4 into 8, and so on. So that division is said to be mitotic division. So what happens? Once the zygote is formed, then it gets converted into embryo. Then if I show you the previous image, this ovule The yellow color part along with the red color egg will be converted into seed. So this will be converted into embryo. This will be converted into seed. And what will happen to the ovary? What will happen to the style? What will happen to the stigma? Outside, if you imagine here, there are petals, sepals. So what will happen to them? So it is said that once the seed is being formed, this ovary which is there is converted into fruit. Okay, ovule, don't get confused. The yellow color part gets converted into seed, ovary gets converted into fruit, and style, stigma, petals, you can say filament, you can say sepals, automatically falls off from the plant, and what you get on the plant is fruit. So basically flower is converted into fruit. You understood how fertilization takes place and how flower is converted into fruit. So what happens? Post fertilization changes. Zygote gets converted into embryo after several divisions. Ovule gets converted into seeds. Ovary gets converted into fruit, and corolla, sepals, or you can say calyx, style, stigma fall off or wither off. Wither off is a biological term for fall off, and that is an automatic process. Sometimes the calyx or the sepals remain on the fruit. So if you buy some fruit, you see a green color leaf like structure basically on guava. So that green color structure is sepals. Sometimes sepals remain, whereas the rest part of the flower automatically falls off after the fertilization has taken place, and finally the fruit with the seed inside is being formed, and slowly and steadily the fruit will fall on the ground. The fruit will decay and the seed will mix with the soil, and slowly and steadily a new plant will grow. This is how sexual reproduction takes place in plants. If you have any doubts, you can write in the comment section. Your doubts will be cleared as soon as possible. If you like the videos, please do subscribe my channel and click on the like button, that is the thumbs up. Thank you so much.